Let's look at how the immune system is organized. So we can first divide it into that innate immune system, which is anything that's present at birth. This includes kind of a general protection against invasion. So we're not going to really be able to, differentiate between different types of bacteria or um, different viruses. We're just trying to keep things out. So it's a very general mechanism. And that's going to include what we call first lines of defense and second lines of defense. Then we have what's known as the adaptive immune system or adaptive immunity. And again, this is the part that develops with time, so it adapts, it gets better. It involves lymphocytes, all right? So this is all about knowing your lymphocytes. So we'll talk about cytotoxic T cells, helper T cells, and B cells. It also has memory. So this system will remember what pathogens looked like, and the second time around, it'll have a stronger and more robust reaction to that pathogen. So this is a very specific way to protect, whereas your first and second lines are very general. So first lines of defense are barriers. So we can barricade the body with our skin. So intact skin is a really strong barrier. Very few organisms can penetrate through skin as long as it's still intact. Now, once it's not intact, you get a cut or a scrape, that definitely opens up the body to infection. Tracts are exposed to the outside, so we line those with mucous membranes. So those tracts would be your respiratory tract, your GI tract, your urinary tract, and reproductive tracts. Those are also areas where pathogens could invade the body. And then third thing mentioned here is called the normal microbiota. The normal microbiota are the microbes that live within you and on you. You might have heard of this called the normal flora. That term isn't really used anymore. It's the normal microbiota. So this is going to be, the healthy bacteria that you have growing on your skin and in your digestive tract. But really, you've got bacteria and other organisms. There are some yeast cells that might live in you, but these things are all protecting you because they take up space, right? They kind of compete with potential pathogens. So if you get a pathogen inside of you, but you've got all this other bacteria, that pathogen really has a hard time causing an infection because there's no place for it. So a lot of times we will do things to try to boost these bacteria. For example, you might have heard of probiotics. Probiotics are basically bacteria in the form of, say, a pill or some other, maybe a drink or something. And what those bacteria do is they will, populate your body and try to protect you from these other organisms. The downside is sometimes we do things to kill off our normal microbiota. So, for example, antibiotics really kill a lot of different types of bacteria. They'll kill the infectious one that you're trying to kill, but they might also kill off some of your normal microbiota. So, a lot of times people will take probiotics after antibiotics to try to replace those bacteria. So first line of defense are all barriers. Second lines of defense are if a pathogen does get in, say it does penetrate through a mucous membrane, you've got some defense kind of waiting for it. So we'll talk about phagocytes, we'll talk about inflammation and fever, and some other substances that you're born with, so they're part of your innate immunity. They're not really specific, so they can't differentiate different pathogens, but they're there to help get any of those pathogens that might have penetrated through your first line of defense. And then third line, again, like I mentioned, those are your lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. B cells produce antibodies, so we'll talk a lot about antibodies in this chapter. So that's kind of the layout. So we're going to start with the first lines of defense. This is just a list, and I'm probably not going to read through every single one of these, but what these all have in common is they form some type of barrier. It could be a physical barrier, it could be a chemical barrier, but these all, in one way or another, can help to prevent a microbe from getting into your tissues, all right, getting through the skin or getting through a mucous membrane. So you have the epidermis, you've got mucus and mucous membranes, so mucus can trap microbes and help prevent them from penetrating in. Even hair can function as a barrier. The nasal hairs, the hairs in your nose, actually help filter out microbes that might be in the air you're breathing in. The rest of the respiratory tract has a lot of cilia, which helps to move the mucus. So things will stick in the mucus and the cilia move it up the respiratory tract so those microbes can't get into your lungs, for example. Tears. So tears help to flush away anything that might be landing on your eyes. Saliva actually can help reduce microbe. It kind of flushes and washes microbes off of your teeth. Saliva also has an enzyme. This enzyme down here called lysozyme helps to kill bacteria, and that's found in your saliva. Urine can flush your urinary tract if there's a microbe that's trying to get in through there. We might eject or expel microbes by defecating or vomiting. That can happen if say you get food poisoning and there's a microbe in the food you're eating. We might be able to get that microbe out of you very quickly. Some of the chemical barriers, sebum is the oily material that's on the surface of your skin. We also use acidity quite a bit. Most microbes don't like acidity, so if we have a little acidic film on the skin, that can help reduce microbes. The vagina is acidic, so vaginal secretions can help to discourage bacterial growth. Stomach acid can kill bacteria. Again, we can use acidity to reduce or even kill microbes. So these are all examples of first lines of defense. Second lines of defense, we're going to focus in on a few of them. We're going to talk about interferons, and these are proteins produced by cells that can help protect from viruses. So we'll talk about those. There's a system called complement, which can help destroy microbes. We're going to talk about different types of phagocytes, which are cells that can ingest foreign matter like microbes. We'll talk about inflammation and what that does. It helps to kind of confine microbes, prevent them from spreading. It also helps to kill the microbes and then help to repair that damaged tissue that might have occurred. And then we'll talk about a fever and how it has benefits to our immune responses. So let's look at what's called interferons. So interferon, that comes from interfering, and what these do is they interfere or block viruses. All right, really interesting thing here. So let's look at this drawing. So this is a cell of your body that's infected by a virus. So this is a virus. And one thing, if you have never taken, let's say, a microbiology course, is that viruses have to infect a cell. So they're harmless outside of cells. A virus can't replicate, all right? So this virus can't become two viruses out here. It's basically harmless out here. But if it gets into a cell, we call that cell either a host cell or this cell is infected by that virus. That virus uses components of the cell in order to replicate. So now this virus becomes very dangerous because it can replicate inside of this host cell and eventually kill this cell. All right? And we've got ways to detect this, so we'll talk about cytotoxic T cells. They can actually detect this cell as being infected, and then it's going to kill this cell. All right, so we don't have a way really to get rid of these viruses without destroying the infected cell. All right, but what's interesting is while this cell is infected, it kind of produces a kind of a protein that can not help itself, but it helps thy neighbor. All right, so these interferons are a way to protect nearby cells. So this is another cell that hasn't been infected yet. All right, so this cell is really doing a good deed in that it's going to warn the neighboring cell and induce a protective mechanism against the virus. So these interferons, so they list here alpha and beta interferons, there's just a couple different types, are proteins that are produced by the infected cell that go to the nearby cells and activate a response that ends up producing other proteins called antiviral proteins, or AVPs. So now this cell is producing these proteins that actually interfere with viral replication. And this virus cannot replicate and therefore cannot cause harm to this cell. So really kind of cool. What's then interesting is once this was all figured out, we actually use interferon as a treatment. We can make interferon and give it as a therapy for certain viral infections. One example is hepatitis. So one of the treatments for hepatitis is interferon. And it's not going to help the cells that already are infected, but it might protect some cells that have yet to become infected. So that's interferon. The next one I want to talk about is called complement. Complement is also a set of proteins that all have this C designation. We're not going to get into details here. I really just want you to remember the three things that these complement proteins can help with. The first thing is they can actually help enhance phagocytosis. So what phagocytosis is, it's the ability of certain cells called phagocytes to ingest microbes. All right, and what happens is these complement proteins will attach to the microbe and help identify it as being a microbe that needs to be ingested or phagocytosed. That process is called opsonization. All right, so that's a fancy word, but it basically means that you're coding or tagging the microbe for destruction. All right, so that's one thing that complement is known to do. Another thing is it helps kind of induce inflammation, and we'll talk more about what inflammation is, but that's a second function of these complement proteins. They actually activate these mast cells and cause them to produce histamine, which causes inflammation. So that's the second thing. The third thing is they help induce cytolysis or cytolysis. That means, breaking cells, and the cells that it helps to break are bacterial cells. So this is a plasma membrane of a bacterium or a microbe, and some of these complement proteins actually kind of join together and form this big giant hole in the bacteria. So it causes what's called a membrane attack complex. So these proteins form this big hole that ends up lysing or breaking open the bacteria. So for complement, just try to remember the three things that complement helps to kind of induce in a response to protect from microbes. Speaking of phagocytosis, these are some kind of common phagocytes in the human body. Macrophages, neutrophils we've heard of. There's another type of phagocyte called dendritic cells. Basically, these are cells that have the ability to take up a microbe, so there's the microbe. They can identify it. Remember that opsonization, so this microbe might be tagged with either complement proteins or antibodies can also do this tagging. They take that microbe in to what's called a phagosome. The phagosome fuses with a lysosome, and if you remember what a lysosome is, it has enzymes that can digest. So these little enzymes in the lysosome break down that phagocytosed pathogen. So now it kills that pathogen. What's really interesting is we're going to see in a little bit that these phagocytes can also then show the immune system that there was this pathogen. So that's known as antigen presentation. So these cells will then go over to the lymphocytes and say, hey, look what I just found. And that's a way to induce the immune response. All right, so let's talk about inflammation. So inflammation is something, you've probably heard of it. We've all had inflammation. You might get it if you get, a cut or a scratch. You might get it in your respiratory tract if you have an infection. You might get it in your knees or other joints if you've got some tissue damage. But the clinical signs are red hot swelling and pain. So tissue is going to get red and hot because the increase in blood flow to the area. The tissue is going to swell, and that's going to be a way to help deliver things into the tissue, and it's going to be painful. What kind of causes this process are what's called inflammatories or pro-inflammatory chemicals. So when you get this tissue damage, the cells of your tissue release chemicals. So right here in this figure it says chemical mediators are released. So tissue damage releases chemicals. And these chemicals are going to cause vasodilation of blood vessels in the area. So the blood vessels get bigger, and that's going to increase blood flow to the area. So now we're going to get a lot more blood flow there. The blood vessels also become more permeable. So things can get out of the blood a lot easier because the blood vessels, what actually happens is the little endothelial cells will separate from one another. So now you can let things out of the blood much easier. So, and the things that exit the blood are antibodies, immune cells can emigrate. So emigration or diapedesis is how cells can exit the blood vessels. All right, and therefore they can get in there and start to kill bacteria. The whole goal here is if you've damaged this barrier, you're going to get bacteria. So you want to get blood there quickly to deliver immune cells. So we'll deliver those neutrophils, and we'll deliver macrophages, and we'll start to kill those bacteria. So some of these pro-inflammatory molecules include histamine. So histamine is a major molecule that causes inflammation. All right, now you got to kind of separate good inflammation from bad inflammation. So this is good inflammation, all right, because you got this sliver, you've got damage, you got bacteria getting in, you want to be able to kill the bacteria, repair the tissue. That's good inflammation. Bad inflammation is chronic. So chronic inflammation is when you got this inflammation for a long time. And chronic inflammation ends up actually causing more damage to tissue. So some people have chronic inflammation in their knees and other joints. You could get chronic inflammation in your respiratory tract from, say, smoking. And that can lead to things like emphysema, chronic bronchitis. So we want to make sure we know the difference between acute inflammation, that's this, happens really quick, but then goes away really quick, versus chronic inflammation. Other molecules that cause inflammation that are all involved are prostaglandins and leukotrienes. They help to intensify inflammation. Once you know the pro-inflammatory molecules, you can better understand what we mean by an anti-inflammatory. One example are antihistamines. All right, we've probably all heard of Benadryl. That's kind of the classic antihistamine. Well, it reduces histamine and therefore can reduce some of this bad inflammation that you might get. We also might have heard of steroids and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So corticosteroids are steroid molecules, right? They're kind of similar to cortisol and other steroid hormones, but they're very strong anti-inflammatories. Prednisone, hydrocortisone, if you've ever used hydrocortisone cream on, say, maybe a itchy skin rash or something, well, that reduces these pro-inflammatories like prostaglandins. NSAIDs are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Those are going to include your aspirin, ibuprofen or Motrin, naproxen. Those are not steroid, but they also decrease these prostaglandins. So instead of intensifying inflammation, they actually reduce inflammation. And these drugs also have analgesic properties, which is pain relief. They have antiplatelet properties. If you remember, aspirin can be used as one of those anticoagulants or blood thinners. And they also have antipyretic properties, that is fever reducing. So these medications are very useful if you have inflammation, if you have pain, but they could thin the blood. Maybe you want to do that with aspirin, or maybe you don't want to do it, but it's going to happen if you take an NSAID. And then you could use them as a fever reducer as well. So the whole goal here is to increase blood flow, get some immune cells in there really quickly, prevent those bacteria from spreading, and then induce tissue repair. We want to be able to repair that damaged tissue. Fever. Fever is a lot like inflammation in that you want to separate a good fever from a bad fever. A bad fever is if it persists for a longer period of time, or if the temperature is very extreme. But a normal fever is actually a good thing. It provides a lot of benefits. It's going to boost the immune responses. Immune cells have to replicate. We call that proliferation. And they replicate much faster when the temperature is a little higher. They have to migrate, so they have to be able to get to the infectious organism so they can do that better. So a little raise in temperature makes your immune system function even better. It also will slow bacterial growth, and it'll help increase tissue repair. So these are all the benefits of a fever. Now, typically, if you know you have a fever, it's done its job already. So I'm not saying, let the fever go and don't do anything about it. But, whenever you do have a fever, you got to think of the bright side, that at least your immune system's getting some benefits from that fever. And what causes a fever are molecules called pyrogens that tell the hypothalamus to keep the temperature higher than normal. So your hypothalamus is your thermostat, right? It determines your body temperature. So these pyrogens actually cause the hypothalamus just to put that temperature up a little bit. All right. Some of these are produced by your immune system. They're called interleukins. These are endogenous pyrogens, meaning they're produced by your immune system or inside of you. Interleukin 1 and interleukin 6 are known to cause fever. Exogenous come from outside the body. So those are molecules that are released by bacteria. One of them is called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. It's actually a component of a certain type of bacteria called the gram-negative bacteria. And when these gram-negative bacteria release this LPS, it'll trigger a fever. So fever is good. unless it's too high or for too long. It's caused by pyrogens that induce the hypothalamus to keep the temperature up. Once you know that, you can target some of these molecules. You can use NSAIDs, again, as antipyretics, or you could use something like Tylenol or acetaminophen. So Tylenol is not a true NSAID. One reason is, if you noticed on the previous slide, it doesn't cause a reduction in inflammation. So it's not anti-inflammatory, but it is antipyretic. All right, so these three can do anti-inflammation and antipyretic, whereas Tylenol is not anti-inflammatory. But the beauty of this is you can use both of these. A lot of times we might switch back and forth between Motrin and Tylenol to control a fever. All right, so that's your second lines of defense. So new video, we're going to get into the adaptive immune system. This is where we're focusing in on the lymphocytes.